All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our lunchtime session. I see the lineup has worked its way through the foods, so we can bring the noise level down here in this room a little bit so we can get into our keynote presentation. Jaimie Boyd is a partner at Deloitte in Canada and serves as the firm's national digital government leader. She works to accelerate digital change in the public sector, helping governments better serve citizens using modern technology. She previously held diverse positions in government, most recently as the Chief Digital Officer for the Government of British Columbia. She serves on a variety of advisory boards, including that for McMaster University, Masters of Public Policy in Digital Society, and GovLab's Open Data Policy Executive Education Program. In 2019, Apolitical named her amongst the world's 100 most influential people in digital government. I met Jaimie when she was with the federal government working on open data. We worked together extensively in her role as Chief Digital Officer at the Government of BC, and I'm happy to welcome her to speak to you today in her current role at Deloitte, joining us virtually, addressing the state of open data around the world. Please welcome Jaimie Boyd.
Thanks so much, Mark. What a pleasure to be here today. And I'm sorry that I can't be there in person, but it's been an absolute thrill to see all the wonderful discussions that are happening at CODS. Just want to check, can you hear me and see my screen and all that sort of thing?
Yes.
Excellent. I love it when the IT works. Okay, well then let's get into it. I'm just really pleased to get to talk to you all today. It's both a pleasure and an honor. Très franchement, ça fait trop longtemps qu'on ne s'est pas vu en tant que communauté de données ouvertes et en tant que réseau de soutien, d'apprentissage et d'action. I'm joining you today from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people out my window here in Victoria. I can see Pecals, which growing up everybody called Mount Doug, which was the traditional gathering place of the Wasanic, Songhees, and Esquimalt First Nations. In the last day and a half, I hope that you've been as inspired as I have with stories of resilience, of data innovation. But in spite of all of that wonderful content, I will be honest, I get worried sometimes. I get worried about the state of data. I get worried about the level of ambition in our ecosystem. I get worried about whether we're actually truly learning as a community, whether we're really moving things forward on the basis of data for our communities. And so what I want to talk about today is the state of open data around the world in hopefully what we can soon call a post-pandemic age. And I want to ask the simple question, what really happened to the data? What happened to the data, to open data, while we were all sheltering in place? I think that if we reflect a little bit on the past few years of open data, at times in the past, I think governments were quite effective at maximizing the release of open data. Here in Canada, many of us who worked in and around the federal government were familiar with the 2014 Directive on Open Government that had us running around Ottawa creating these data inventories and systematically looking to maximize the release of data. We had over 360,000 data sets. You know, we got a little nervous if anybody asked us about the quality of the data, but there sure was a lot of it. And that imperative, you know, it had its problems, but it was also a relief because at least it wasn't us sitting here waiting for a CD-ROM to arrive in the mail, which is something that, you know, many of us did as late as the early 2010s. At least it wasn't a canceled census. And so we diligently maximized release, anticipating that even if we didn't necessarily make the best use of data within government, our ecosystem around us would figure out how to create impact from that data. And I think we saw the error in our ways. We realized that we had to be a little bit more tactical. The International Open Data Charter was updated accordingly. We recognized that there was a tremendous cost associated with open data. People like myself, I started my federal career as an economist, and I lost, frankly, years of my life cleaning data. We recognize the cost of cleaning data. We recognize the cost of responsibly managing data flows for public release. We recognize the cost of managing the risks, especially as the mosaic effect became more and more prevalent, especially as we became more attuned to privacy and ethics risks. And so what we've seen is over the last 10 years or so, this sort of growing sophistication in the world of data, in open data, that for me really reinforces the importance of being systematic about open data. And it reinforces the sustained need for communities like this one that are constantly looking to professionalize ourselves. So on that basis, why did I want to talk about the state of open data globally? We've had good progress in Canada. We've had a growing understanding of the importance of data stewardship, identity management. We've even had some really interesting experimentation around ethics in the use of data. And all of these really wonderful pieces of progress, for me, herald almost a new era of open data, where we can say we are no longer just maximizing the release of open data. We are focused on community impact. And there is a new opportunity for ambition. So, what should that ambition look like? Well, I'd like to tell a few stories. I'd like to draw some inspiration from what's been happening in the last few years around the world. We know that data globally is becoming more available. Certainly within Canada, we've done well. We were recognized in the 2019 Open Data Barometer as being equal first, tied with the UK for the quality of our at least our federal open data. And there was really good progress. But the ubiquity of this open data also makes it harder to really be sure that we're putting the data to great use. So there's that tension that's only going to become more and more acute between the public value from sharing data and the need to keep the public's data private, secure. And so I want to talk about a few things today. I'm hoping that at the end of the next sort of 20 minutes, you're going to have a few really great stories that are worth Googling, that are worth reviewing. I'm hopeful that you're going to leave with a little bit more conviction and sort of language in your tool belt to communicate to your organization that open data is critical now and always. And I'm also hopeful that for those of you who aren't already thinking about this carefully, that we need to have systems level change to enable open data. We need to create systems level enablers, things like data ethics, things like governance. And through data governance, we can leverage ecosystem partners in a way that we haven't really been able to before. So I'm going to tell you some stories. I'm going to tell you about user centricity in Uruguay, about impact through open data in South Africa and Paraguay. I'm going to tell you about data ethics in Ukraine, the UK, and a little bit here at home. I'll talk about non-traditional data sources in the US and data governance for open data in India and beyond. And I know that this is a lot and it's going to be a flyby. I've got lots of great sources that I would be delighted to share with you. I'll also admit right off the bat that I've cribbed a whole lot of this from the work that we've been doing through the GovLab's Open Data Policy Lab. And I'm really not trying to offer a sort of end-to-end diagnosis of here is the state of maturity of open data globally. I'm trying to offer some insight into trends that I'm seeing with humility, in the spirit of continuous learning, and with the hope that you'll take some of these stories home as fodder for your own open data efforts. So, what did we learn? Well, I'm certainly not the only one that's looking to collect these insights. As I said, the GovLab out of NYU has been doing a great job. I'll also recognize that our friends from the Treasury Board Secretariat have been really active. The most recent meeting of the OECD's expert group on open government data also dug into lessons, and there's a wonderful report online. But just really anecdotally, to get the creative juices flowing, some of the insights that we started gathering were, wow, data really matters. COVID was intense and it really put the importance of data at the fore. We confirmed that making data widely available can improve decision making. Yes, we confirmed that it can build transparency. It can help us develop new innovations. We also saw that it comes with an imperative for strong data governance that's thoughtful, that's driven by user needs. And we saw that data maturity is not the same across our fine country. So please take this content, share it broadly, rip it apart, Let's really commit to that spirit of continuous learning. So I'm gonna rant a little bit and give you some suggestions for things that we can draw from those global trends that we can use here at home in Canada. So first thing I'd like to rant about, start with users. And yes, that applies for data too. I work in digital services now. I'm a consultant and I help governments across Canada build wonderful service experiences. And it makes sense. I mean, everybody talks about digital services and they always say start with users. It's in the Government of Canada's digital principles. It's all over the place. But we don't always apply that focus to the data space. We know that humans are unique and so are our needs. And most of the time, those generic universal designs or one size fits all approaches, they don't work out too well. And there's lots of evidence for that. The same goes for data. And that's something that is sometimes less obvious to people, right? And so as we talk about delivering great services, we need to think about great data to enable those services. So let me be a little bit more nuanced here. One of the things that a lot of our clients and our friends globally ask us about is how might we design around life events? How can we make those seamless service experiences? Well, good news is we have lots of great tools. So we can talk about having better micro-segmentation of citizen groups. We can talk about mass customization. We can talk about services that are triggered by life events. And we have lots of content online, happy to share links. But the data needs to be in place, and it works best if that data is open when possible. So examples of user-centric use of data to design services would be things like demographic level service data. So that would be public data, aggregated, of course, around age, income, race, and behavioral traits associated with those segments. Same goes for location and geographic specific services. So looking at, for example, how can we draw insights around which parts of our communities are high crime regions or sort of the higher degrees of poverty or underserved with regards to infrastructure. These are all things that are going to help us design better services. But that really means that we have to be thoughtful about the sort of data that we're going to be collecting to enable this. And of course, it requires also some degree of buy-in from people to use this. So what can that look like in practice? Well, a good example for me was health services in Uruguay. Some of you may have heard this case study. It's been around for a few years. Uruguay has a wonderful service. It's called A Tu Servicio, at your service. And what happens, every February, people in Uruguay get to choose whether or not to stay with their current healthcare provider, which is lovely, especially for somebody like me who doesn't have a doctor, like so many people in BC. But essentially what Uruguay did is they worked with the civic tech community to create a public dashboard on doctor performance data. And that was going to help inform people's decision. So it's got things like the hours of service for that doctor, their specialization, wait times, and it also has user reviews. And so in a mixed public-private healthcare system, this kind of user-centric data around service delivery that is designed and built and managed around specific patient needs is going to be critical for enabling better health outcomes. Okay, so next thing that we've been seeing in lots of case studies around is a growing focus on impact. So that would be another takeaway that I would recommend from Global Insights. Let's focus on impact and focus on the machines. And so when we make data open, we need to be consistently focusing on updating those data sets. We all know about the quality imperatives, right? Tracking versioning, when you can, building out APIs, making your data findable, making it easy to use. We all know this sort of thing. And there are some great presentations this morning around increasing quality. We also need to be rigorous about publishing with purpose and focusing on that impact. Right? And so this would be things like within Canada, the Global Affairs Interface for Development Funds that not only offers public accountability data around international development funding, but it also matches that with the impact of those funds. So a couple of examples to light that one up for you. Going back to South America, Paraguay. Here, Paraguay's National Public Procurement Agency started publishing open data on public contracts. And they did this particularly in the context of COVID. And so what it did was it ended up creating an early warning system with real-time monitoring of all emergency procurement processes. Within government, this is certainly something that we were doing during COVID. What I think is really special about this is the extent to which Paraguay went to great lengths to make this systematic and use citizen-centric dashboarding. And so you see here a government official within the government of Paraguay monitoring public procurement in real time, not doing public accountability after the fact, but looking for those early warnings. And it allowed journalists, activists, civil society, all sorts of entities, including government officials, to be really proactive about that monitoring. Another example of how we can do this sort of work, this is a case study from South Africa. There was a lot of scrutiny around the price of medications. And so they created their medicine price registry application, which allows patients to compare medicine prices and essentially was designed for ensuring that there was accountability for the prices charged for people who are navigating the health system. And so we can see the importance not just of designing around user needs, but designing around user needs for public impact and for those people who are going to need it the most. Next trend that I'd love for us to take away for Canada is to get increasingly creative around our data sources. So we have the opportunity for new, really meaningful cross-sector collaboration on data. And there are great entities that are doing a fabulous job here. The MasterCard Foundation is investing heavily in data philanthropy here within Canada. Out of U of T, we have the Reach Alliance. And so there are entities that are starting to get excited about this. But what are we really talking about? We're talking about the new opportunities associated with non-traditional data. And that's data that we would define as being digitally captured, mediated, observed, using new instrumentation mechanisms, right? So for example, you would say, okay, can I look at sewage to give me insight into data sources? Into health outcomes. And so this is the sort of thing that we have done in the past in consumer marketing and whatnot. But this is a new twist on non-traditional data for the purpose of public impact. It's nascent for sure. And there has to be a whole lot more work around how to do it ethically and effectively. But what a wonderful opportunity in terms of driving the ubiquity of data-driven insights. So what this can look like in practice within the US, there were really interesting movements to look at search data. So in the same way that we would perhaps within government look at chatbot data and say, oh, everybody is asking the government about, for us, and when I was in the government of British Columbia during COVID, lots of people were asking the chatbot, of course, do I have COVID? What are the symptoms of COVID? But what kind of outdoor public recreation facilities are available? We're like, well, what? It's a pandemic. Why do people care about going golfing? And then it was like, oh, because there is a mental health crisis also looming and people are losing their minds at home. And so that's a way that we can, that we have in many cases been thoughtful about using sort of non-traditional data sources to gather insights. What we're seeing now is a greater systematization of the use of these non-traditional data sources to inform public impact. So the screenshot that you see here is from a collaboration between the World Bank and Google Trends. And the World Bank developed a global dashboarding that included about 200 countries that took internet search term data and correlated that with COVID-19 symptoms and did that for most of 2020, right? And so it makes it really interesting to see what people are concerned about. We also saw this in South Africa, where there was a compilation of wastewater data collected that was from across the country, turned into a dashboard, and that was used to track COVID cases. Really interesting work there. So non-traditional data, user centricity, that focus on impact, those are all really going to be important trends. I would also argue, however, that we have to be thoughtful about what the role of ethics in all this. And we need to be much more assertive in this regard. We've done in Canada a wonderful job of thinking about algorithmic transparency and the ethics of the use of algorithms. But what about the data that we put into those algorithms? So the next trend is a move towards moving way upstream on data ethics. And there has been good experimentation, right? So within the government of the United Kingdom, they have their new center or newish center for data ethics and innovation, which is fabulous. We've also seen ILDA, the Latin American Open Data Institute, working on a feminist open data standard. And it is an interesting challenge because you hear about these wonderfully laudable instances. Here's one that really jumped to mind for me. This one's from the Ukraine. So fabulous in terms of creating transparency around sanctions. But what's the role of privacy in these kinds of dynamics, right? And so we do need to be thoughtful about the precedent that our ethical choices make. And so this case study, I think, is interesting, and we can talk about whether it's appropriate or not in other contexts. But it's from the National Agency for the Prevention of Corruption of Ukraine, which developed its portal War and Sanctions. And essentially what it does is it collects information about individuals and legal entities that are subject to sanctions in the context of the Russian invasion. Right? And so this raises really interesting questions. A sort of cleaner example, in my view, of a best practice is from right here at home. And I know this was supposed to be a world tour, but I actually couldn't find a better example of a good approach to data ethics than at home in BC, where over the past year, the government of BC went out and spoke to over 20,000 people and said, hey, we know that there is scrutiny around the ethics of our use of data. And so we'd like to ask you, how do you think that we should be collecting data? How should we be using it, especially in the context of inclusion and anti-racism? And people said, well, we'd like clarity. And so that was the genesis of BC's new Anti-Racism Data Act, which is law today, and one of the most exciting legislative moves that I've seen in Canada and around the world when it comes to data ethics. Last trend, and then I'll wrap up. And it's a spicy one. It's fix the damn data governance. We have been talking about all of these wonderful things that we can do, and data practitioners in Canada are having a tremendous impact. I worry, however, that we're doing all these wonderful things in spite of our systems rather than because of them. We need to be thoughtful about building in user control, about getting the greatest value from our shared data, by empowering users and rights holders to manage data as they think is appropriate. And that means building trust. That means dialogue. It means all of the things we discussed before around user centricity. But we're only going to see more and more prevalence of things like gray data. And we're going to have to think, is this data truly a candidate for release, or should it be released in an anonymized fashion to a secure sandbox environment? Right. And so I think increasingly we're not going to have just open data and closed data. There's going to be all sorts of shades in between. Many of us, in my view, struggle to answer critical questions around who owns the data, who stores it, who stewards it, how is it stored, how is it accessed, under what conditions. And these are things that we need to be systematic about when it comes to data governance, and really, really focus on building out interoperability frameworks, having alignment around standards. And these are things that don't just happen organically. They happen because people like you in the room online today, because we build it. And so I'll close there. I hope that some of these examples from around the world have been a little bit inspiring. I hope that you'll take away the importance of putting your users at your center, focusing on impact, being systematic about the use of data standards, about ethics. And I hope that you will continue to fight the good fight when it comes to open data. Thank you.
So we have time here for a few questions. If you're in the room, you can find yourself to the microphones on the side. If you're online, you can type them in the chat. I think Jaimie can see them there. But while we're waiting for that to queue up, it sounds like, the number of times that governance has come up over the last couple of days. I mean, there's a workshop, there's a summit, there's some kind of like, let's figure this thing out, right? And I think there's a lot of opportunity. I've heard it mentioned in so many different contexts, in so many different perspectives on what it means and what a good version of governance looks like. I think this is a topic that, the community could use a little more discourse of, and probably a couple of days just on data governance. So, that might be something for the pipeline for our get-togethers. Before I get to the first microphone question, I have one of my own that I'll maybe throw toward you, Jaimie. Publishing with purpose versus the principle of just publishing data and let the free society figure out what to do with it. Just putting that tabular data out there and saying, let the entrepreneurs, let the nonprofits, let civil society get a hold of it and let them figure out what to do with it. Don't try and figure out what the answer is before you publish it and let people work with it. So that's vision one. Vision two, is more around publish with purpose, know where you're going before you begin the journey. So, maybe you could just kind of put those two ideas together so we can all kind of have a framework for thinking about those two ideas.
Yeah, it's a great question, and in all transparency, it's something that we struggled with quite a bit within the government of Canada, and it was a big part of why we originally created that tool to suggest a data set. We thought, well, there is a cost associated with releasing data. It's not like data magically appears on a portal, right? You have to go and find it, and you have to work on data quality and all that sort of thing. You have to keep it up to date and manage it, and hopefully track the impact of it. And so I think that this concept of maximize the release of data versus publish with purpose, it is a choice, and I don't know that either is completely wrong, but in a resource scarce environment, publishing with purpose seems to me to be the best choice. And I don't mean simply going through a beauty contest. I don't mean just, there are 50 upvotes and the other data set has 2 upvotes, so let's go with the 50. It means having a bit of a rationale for why we would apply government resources, taxpayer dollars, to improving a data asset. And so there has to be a little bit of a story there. It could be that accountability is critical, and this is just something that we value. It could be that a journalist that says, hey, this is important for me, building out a narrative. There could be 2 people that want to make use of that data, but those are critical users. I just think that there's a real value in being systematic about that cost-benefit analysis. The other consideration in making that deliberation is to think about who's going to be impacted. So often we allow the loudest voices to shape our approach to designing and delivering services and the data assets to support that. Often, however, it's people who are underserved who are going to have the most benefit for their actual lives associated with mobilizing these data assets. And so those would be my 2 considerations in navigating those 2 competing visions. One would be, how do we maximize value in a cost-restricted environment? And 2, how do we make sure that we're not just aligning with the demands of the loudest voices, but that we are truly building out a data ecosystem that reflects our values and supports all of our communities?
Fabulous. Thank you for that response. I'm going to go to mic number 1, and then we'll have mic number 2 here in the room. Derek, please.
Sweet. Hello, Jaimie.
Hi, Derek.
So two-parter
You're
question.
looking very northerly.
I'm trying to fit in. Two-part question. I guess the first part, so we talked a bit about this last week at Forward 50, but Canada dropping from being one of the top ranked countries in the world in terms of digital government to being 32nd now. And obviously data and open data is a big part of that. I guess the first part is, why do you think we've dropped so far and so fast? And then the second thing is, given you gave us a bunch of different things to focus on, but if we could only focus on one thing, what do you think is the most important thing we should focus on to change that trend?
Great questions, and I love it when the worlds of digital and data get knitted together more closely. So thank you for making that connection. Yeah, we've had an abysmal drop, and it is actually a fairly interesting question. We went out, and this is an area of passion for me, and so we've done quite a bit of research on this topic within Canada. There's lots of documentation around digital maturity globally, but I wanted to understand, why was it that in such a high capacity country, we win awards for having the best public service in the world. We've made massive investments in public education. We have some of the brightest people I've had the privilege of working with in this ecosystem. Why are we dropping? Well, we looked at it specifically through the frame of cloud, but I think that the insights that we gathered apply more broadly. The barriers that we found to cloud adoption in the public sector are fourfold. The first was complexity in the governance, the lack of alignment between the business and the technical side. We saw real challenges in navigating CapEx versus OpEx, so sort of antiquated financial guidance. We also saw talent challenges. It was not really a retention problem, but it was an upskilling problem. And we also saw major challenges around the security process, sort of rather than green lighting for all entities, a very repetitive and slow process. And all of those things, I'm sure that people are, you start maybe writing them down and you're like, I'm not writing those down. Those are obvious, and that's almost the problem here. The solutions to our problems are not that complicated. And at the risk of offending folks, I would suggest that what we are lacking today is courage and leadership and an ability to truly take a systems level and ecosystem based approach. We have tremendously bright people who know how to build better systems. Let's get at it. And I think that is a leadership gap. So that's what I would argue. I hope it isn't too dissatisfying, given that I think the explanations are really quite simple. You asked which of the sort of 5 trends should we look at the most. For me, it would be the one we started with: users. We start with the users. We design our data assets around the user experience that we want to generate. We do so with inclusion, with an eye to sustainability, with an eye to respect for the taxpayer. We make the world a better place every day of the week.
Thanks, Jaimie.
Thank you for the question. Thank you, Jaimie. And now on mic 2, sir.
Great. Yeah, we have 2 questions online, so I'm just going to relay them. The first one relates to the leadership encourage you were just mentioning, from Alan Christie, who asks, inside the government of Canada, is there advice for getting entry-level executives to open up with their service line data silos and key movement discussions?
Yeah, great question. So if you're in the public service, how do you get started? Well, good news is every federal department and agency has an open data champion. So start with a little chat with them. There's also lots of guidance online. I would say get familiar with the infrastructure that's available. I know that Steve DaCosta is at the conference. He's one of the pros when it comes to the infrastructure. The way we've implemented CCAN within Canada makes it pretty easy. It is folks who are in the departments are able to upload their own data, and then it gets approved by the OCIO. And so it is relatively self-serve. So I would say get familiar with the infrastructure, get familiar with the data standards in your space, align with the data standards. It drives me absolutely batty when people go out and they put out, for example, procurement data, and they say, oh, this is fabulous. We're being very proactive about aligning with accountability mechanisms, without looking at the open contracting data standard, which has pretty great guidance on how to make that data relevant across jurisdictional lines. And so align with your data standards, and then work hard to make sure that you're being responsible and ethical, and you've got buy-in from senior leadership so that they aren't going to get surprised, so that they see this as an exciting move on your part, so that the community is thrilled to see this rather than caught off guard. And so I would really just go through, and all of this is documented within the Government of Canada's open data checklist for release. I don't know if anybody from the federal government's in the room, but I'm sure they can help you navigate. There's great guidance. But I would say be thoughtful about, self-serve and making sure that you are aligning with community needs as effectively as possible. Great question.
Next one.
Yeah, we have time for one more. We'll make that the last one for this session. We gotta.
Great, thanks. Yeah, the second question from online is from Alicia Capello, who asks, do you happen to have any resources you'd recommend on data ethics?
Yeah, well, I would really, really recommend checking out the Government of BC's microsite on the Anti-Racism Data Act. It's fantastic. It's really, really good. The UK Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation also has quite a bit of good content. The other entity that I've seen with decent content on data ethics is the World Economic Forum. And so this is sort of a nascent space. So there is sort of good growing level of interest. And there are some sort of good examples, but it's kind of fun for me that some of the best examples that I've seen are actually from right here at home. One other consideration, just, we're in Canada. One of the best courses that I've taken in data in the last few years was from the First Nations Information Governance Center. For all of us who are working in the data space, I think we should absolutely be taking our OCAP training. Every single one of us. If you haven't, I would recommend it. It's not that expensive. It's pretty fun. Do it with your team. And that, I think, is a great start for making sure we aren't just taking the advice of the World Economic Forum. Let's actually have our homegrown Canadian approach that thinks of the diverse needs of rights holders and various folks and communities across Canada. And just, I think upskilling ourselves is probably the best place to start when it comes to data ethics.
Well, thank you for that response. Thank you for your presentations today, Jaimie. Certainly always interesting, always relevant, and always provocative and authentic. So, thank you very much for kind of sharing your insights, wealth of experience here in the room. We're going to move on to maybe we should.
Thank you so much for having me, Mark, and congratulations on convening such an important dialogue at such a critical time.